Now, we come to the bishops in our lineage. They were the old world immigrants to the U.S., like Richard Duc de Palatine from Australia, who is deceased, Bishop Adrian Spruit from Holland, who is deceased, Bishop Torkom Saraydarian from Armenia, who is now deceased, and Bishop Stephan Hoeller from Hungary, Bishop Paul Vagantes from Canada, who was part of Wolsey's successions, Bishop Rosamonde Miller from Cuba and Spain, who was consecrated by Stephan Hoeller, Bishop Jennie, my reader, from England, who is now deceased, who was consecrated by me, or rather consecrated by Spruit, sorry about that. And then there were native bishops in our lineage. Warren and Helen Waters, who are from Santa Barbara, who are now deceased. And Bishop George Boyer in London. Now, Bishop Palatine was a very important occultist and serious bishop. He was from Australia. This is a drawing that was done of Palatine. He was the teacher and I believe the consecrator of both Bishops Boyer in England and Bishop Hoeller, Stephan Hoeller, from Hungary. And he was very much respected by them, but he also was very strict and had some very important theories that he shared. And he believed that the earliest form of Christianity, which he called Christianity, from the term as it was used by one of the Roman historians, Christ is the root for the word meaning the best. Christ is the root for Christ, but he called it Christianity, and the idea was that it was not just something that was limited to the Christian idea of the Christ, but to a far more Gnostic concept of the best. This is a photograph of Bishop George Boyer, who is a dear friend and associate of mine, and we exchanged lineages subconditionally. And this is another picture of him the year before he passed away. So Bishop George Boyer passed away peacefully in the hospital after the Palm Sunday weekend in 2008. He was the successor to Bishop Richard, the Duke de Palatine, and he was abbot of the Teaching and Healing Order of St. Michael and St. Raphael. And his wife, Bishop Lila Boyer, also in London, the successor of George Boyer, passed away on February 19th of 2015 in the hospital. I had a chance to visit them before they passed away. And so the abbotship of the Teaching and Healing Order of St. Michael and St. Raphael passed to me. Here's a picture of Bishop George Boyer with Bertil Persson, who were members of a Templar order of Jerusalem in Europe. And Bertil Persson was a very important chronicler and historian of the independent bishops, and kept journals and kept a special academy and library where he maintained all the records so that he could. And he was in contact with me many times. He has passed away, and his successors are now working with his library. This is Persson. Bishop Stephan Hoeller, a very, very important Gnostic bishop from Hungary. He was rather brutalized by the communists when they invaded, and still has scars on his face from that. And that left him to be kind of a testy person when I first knew him back in the 80s and 70s. But he was the consecrator of Bishop Rosamonde Miller. These are pictures taken from his sanctuary in Hollywood, and he has the author of many, many books on a Gnostic approach to Christianity, a new kind of Gnosticism, not really second century Gnosticism. The Gnostic Jung and the Seven Sermons to the Dead are one of his books, Gnosticism, Ancient Traditions, and Inner Knowing, and there's many other books like this. Bishop Rosamonde Miller has been a good friend ever since she was consecrated by Bishop Hoeller and two others, and came up to visit me on her way to Palo Alto with her then husband David Miller, thus Rosamonde Miller. And she is very well known. She's been interviewed on the BBC in their series on Gnosticism. She's a lover of cats. She's about my age, almost my age, and she now has her sanctuary in Redwood City, and you can find that location and other information at gnosticsanctuary.org. But she is a fantastic person, born in Cuba, and her father was murdered by one faction of the Cuban rebels. She worked in journalism, and she was imprisoned and suffered some serious after effects from being in prison, and was sent to Spain. And she became eventually a hierophant of the Order of Mary Magdalene, established in a convent in France. The picture at the lower right hand is a picture of the second sanctuary she had. The first sanctuary she had in Palo Alto was actually a rented business office that she had transformed into a beautiful sanctuary. That was the place where I consecrated Barbara Marx Hubbard. But this photograph here is a photograph of the next location she had, and it was a beautiful church, beautifully decorated, but she was, after so many years, she was forced to pull out of it because of financial concerns and losing support from some others. And so she now has her sanctuary in Redwood City. She's been interviewed in many magazines and things like this, and she's very well known and respected around the world. Bishop Adrian Spruit was my consecrator. He was a very articulate and educated man, taught a lot of classes, and was a member of some of the earlier people who brought and consolidated the lines of succession. He came over from Holland originally, and he established what we call the Church of Antioch, which eventually went through some splits and so on. And here, the picture at the bottom of the right hand here is Bishop Spruit's mother, Jennie, whom he consecrated as a bishop. After having met her and been so amazed with her abilities and her sanctity. This is a good picture of Spruit as he was holding forth in a Eucharist. Now, Bishop Warren Prall Walters was an amazing man. I knew him in the last part of his life, lived in Santa Barbara with his wife, and he had been, many years before, he had been actually the superintendent of schools in Watsonville, California, where I lived for some time. And he was living now in Santa Barbara, and he was a very well-trained classical pianist, could have had a career doing just that. And I used to visit him with my family over many years, and published in his Esoteric Review magazine and so on. But he was a remarkable person that he has passed away, and his wife have passed away now. My closest associate and my real spiritual elder brother was Bishop Torkom Saraydarian, who came over from Armenia after the slaughter of the Armenians by the Turks. He was ordained by the Armenian Orthodox Church, and he was head of the Armenian school in Los Angeles. And when they needed a new bishop for the area, because the old one was no longer able to fulfill his functions, he was the obvious choice. But in order to do so, he would have had to renounce his non-Orthodox views, because he was very involved in theosophy, especially the writings of Alice Bailey and so on. And he chose not to accept consecration in the Armenian Orthodox Church, and instead was consecrated as an independent bishop, and was part of a group called the Independent Church of Antioch, which consisted of several other bishops, including Warren Waters, who had broken away from Spruit after he had apparently had a series of some strokes or TIAs that changed his personality and made him into a very difficult person to work with. And so they had organized a separate independent Church of Antioch. But he was an author of all kinds of great books, and is the author of them. His daughter is now the person who oversees his publications, and she's an incredible person. He passed away in the late 80s, and he is seen here in a photograph with his second wife. And I strongly suggest you acquaint yourself with the writings of Torkom Saraydarian. My teacher, Mother Jennie, I've written her biography, her autobiography, as she gave it to me. Born in Nottingham, England, became extremely psychic, and worked as a nurse in the plains in Saskatchewan and among the homesteaders. Finally ended up in Santa Cruz, California, where I met her in her 90s, and through my interaction with her, she gathered a very large group of people who would meet at her little house on Tuesday evenings, and that's all recounted in my book, my biography of her, which I would strongly recommend you might want to read. It's called Mother Jennie's Garden. Now, the following are bishops that I have consecrated as of now, when I'm dictating this, December 2018. They are all friends and colleagues, the ones that are still alive. I am not mostly putting in the names of bishops who are not still living, but there are several who have passed, who I also had consecrated. You can get a more complete list at hometemple.org under the bishops page. I call them apostles of a new age, or Keizer's brood. Michael Zaharakis, deceased, Bishop Barbara Marks Hubbard, Bishop Lawrence Williams, and 3 other liberal Catholic Church priests that I consecrated the Episcopate, and many others that I will talk about and list as we proceed. People that you should be familiar with. Bishop Zaharakis, Alberto Lacava, had a very large, active Spanish-speaking group in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania of people, and he worked with me for a long time in training priests for Home Temple and Temple of the Holy Grail. Bishop Michael Zaharakis was a remarkable person, very psychic, who did a lot of work in Portland. He organized the Winchell's Donut Workers. He was very socially conscious. He was actually a member of the Wobblies, and so he was the first bishop I consecrated. Others were my ex-wife Tess Popper and Marie Lumazar. There were several liberal Catholic clergy that I ultimately ended up consecrating. They were priests. The first and most important, I would say, of these people was Bishop Lawrence Williams, who was in Ojai, was the head of the Liberal Catholic Church Seminary. And he also, with his wife, ran the Oak Meadow School, which was actually it was a home study school and now an online school. And he had been very unhappy with the Liberal Catholic Church's attitude towards women, which is that women were not ordained and they were not considered to be capable of handling ritual and liturgy in the Eucharist, because Charles Leadbeater, who was one of the founders of the Liberal Catholic Church, had some very strong opinions about this, and his opinions were continued throughout the century as the old Liberal Catholic Church began to really crystallize. And when eventually, after a few years of my encouraging him to stay in his position, because he would have been a really good candidate for the next presiding bishop of the Liberal Catholic Church in America, and could have made some changes, but it just didn't happen, didn't look possible. So finally, he asked me to consecrate him, and I did. I also consecrated some other wonderful people. One was Carlos Florido, who is a good Facebook friend, and a few other LCC clergy who wanted to disconnect with the LCC Church. In 1993, in his office in San Francisco, I consecrated Eugene Whitworth and his wife Ruth, who were heads of the Great Western Brotherhood and Great Western University. He was the author of many esoteric works. The most famous was The Nine Faces of Christ, which has been published in many languages all over the world. And he had originally written radio scripts back in the 30s, and then his novels were published after that. There are many that you can find that are still in print, even though he passed away maybe 17 years ago or so. Now, I had a manuscript I had written in the 70s called The Astral Man, which was full of a whole lot of esoteric hints. And he liked it very much, wanted to buy it from me. I didn't want to sell it, but he asked if he could then edit it and we would both get equal credit, and he could show me a lot of tricks about how to really set up a novel right and so on. So we did that and we published it. It wasn't very successful as a big selling novel, but after his death and Ruth's in the early 2000s, I simply republished it, my original version, because I thought it was actually much better than his at that point. This is a photograph of Bishops Warren Smith on the upper left-hand side, my ex-wife, Bishop Tess Popper, myself on the right-hand side, and Bishops Eugene and Ruth Whitworth, taken at the time of their consecration. One of my favorite people, and I think one of the really great prophets of the age, is Barbara Marks Hubbard. I consecrated her at Rosamond Miller's sanctuary, privately, and she's gone on to do a lot of very important things. I mean, at one point she was a vice presidential candidate. So I had a long history with her. She's written lots of books. I recommend everything she's written and the things she's done. She has a great vision. This is Bishop Lacava, or Zohariel, now known as Mar Ignatius Alexander I, a patriarch who's retired of the old Catholic Apostolic Church of the Americas. Has been very important in bringing in a lot of Spanish-speaking people and collaborated with me for many, many years. I consecrated him in the early 90s. I think it was 96 or something, when I consecrated some other bishops. And he has been very active in promoting independent apostolic lines of succession, especially to Hispanic people. This is a picture of a gathering of Lacava's priests and bishops, which I took at his home in New Jersey many years ago. He doesn't seem to be very active at this point. Some of the people he consecrated were Carlos Flores, Juan Doris, Grace Franco, who's collaborated with me on many things. She's was the secretary to the mayors of New York City for several mayors. Bishop Woody Lacava and Dennis Delorme in Canada was consecrated by Bishop Mar Ignatius, and Father Carlos, Father Willie, Mother Julia, many other people. This is a chart of the home temple lines of apostolic succession as of 1995, and they show the lines of succession to Mar Ignatius Alexander I, who we've been speaking about. And these charts were drawn by Frater Luis Eduardo Londano, who I consecrated. And you can find this online and go through it if you're interested. Basically, it shows the lines of succession through the Antiochene and the Byzantine and the Russian Orthodox and the Roman Old Liberal Catholic successions down to me and to Mar Ignatius and Herman Adrian Spruit. This is another chart that Mar Ignatius put together for himself, showing also other successions he received from me, from the Syro-Chaldean succession, the Anglican and Celtic successions, and the Armenian Union succession, Coptic Irish Wealth, Mariavite, and so on. All of these you can find in my list of apostolic successions, all 22 of them, on the Home Temple site. This is a little kind of bearing in on the various successions that were brought by me through to Mar Ignatius Alexander I. And this is a final chart that he put together showing that succession. I consecrated Bishops Christine Payne Towler and Tim Storey at about the same time, about 1996, after I had already consecrated Barbara Marx Hubbard and Alberto Lacava. This is a picture we took in my home with my my soon-to-be wife, Bishop Willa, who is on the next to me. I'm on the left-hand side, and she's below me there on the left-hand side. And then next to me is are the Storleys, and Tim is next to Christine on the far right, and Tim is a counselor and aficionado of esoteric lines of succession, and he received a lot of initiations. Christine became the person who ran the tarot lines on AOL, and has done that for a long time. She's an expert on tarot and astrology and has written several books. This is a picture of her, and here's a book here that I contributed a chapter to called The Underground Stream, about the esoteric aspect of tarot. There's Tim, and Tim edited some of my book called Initiation of the Grail Mysteries. People confused him with me because it said the author was Grail Master, that's me, and Bishop Timothy Storley. Well, he wasn't the Grail Master, but what he did is made a lot of footnotes and wrote one chapter. Anyway, he's a person who's done a lot of work in the esoteric world. Bishop Willa Keizer and I were married in 1999, I believe it was, and then we separated about 8 years later, and our divorce was final in I think it was 2015. We were still friends, and she went through a lot of interesting initiations and got eventually involved in Tibetan Buddhism, and is very far involved in that, and teaches people that and homeopathy. She was a homeopath and has a homeopathic school, and called the Caduceus Institute, which is part of the nonprofit Home Temple. And she now lives up in Mount Shasta in a home she's bought after we sold our home and split the proceeds. She's not operating really as a bishop so much anymore. She's operating as a teacher and in the realm of Tibetan Buddhism. This is Elias Ibrahim. He was a wonderful person, lived in Australia, near Sydney. This is a photograph of him doing a marriage ceremony at the Theosophical Library and Sanctuary in Sydney, Australia. That's a picture of Blavatsky up behind him. He was a person who had been raised in Palestine, and eventually I came to Australia and I consecrated him after several years of conversations. And he was a wonderful person, but unfortunately he died. Rather difficult death several years ago, many years ago. This is another picture of Elias. The person that I have put in place of Elias since Elias passed is Bishop Francois Bothma. He's no longer in Sydney, Australia. He lives in a place called Orange. He's a knight commander for Australia of the OMR, and I have transmitted to him Grand Masterships of many lines, Martinist and Fratres Lucas and so on. And he is a dentist and a dental surgeon. He has volunteered his time for Doctors Without Borders. He and his partner are from South Africa and moved to Australia. And he's the person that should be contacted in Australia for whatever needs people have regarding Home Temple. Bishop Ken Keach is living in Chiang Mai, Thailand. He's on the Home Temple Board of Directors. Ken was a banker for many, many years and a teacher of about banking and loans and things. And when he retired, he moved to Thailand, to Chiang Mai, and married a wonderful woman there, and they have a really nice home. And he's living there now, and he's online on Facebook and other kinds of places, and very accessible. And I last time I visited him was a couple of years ago when I flew around the world, and but I'm in contact with him all the time. This is a photo of Bishops Marita, Tofa, Luis, Ed, Daniel Dornbos with Bishops Willa and myself, and Ken Keach, which these people were all consecrated in one massive ceremony at the home temple yurt at the same time. Since then, Tofa has died. Ken has moved to Thailand. Ed lives up in near Seattle, and Willa and I have been divorced. And Marita is who is part Sioux Indian and teaches young Native American people their own traditions, has moved to New Mexico. This is Bishop Ron Shelton in the very center of this photo. I went back to his place. He was invited, and I was brought over to give a series of lectures and to exchange subconditional consecrations for the Apostolic Celtic Church a few years ago. These are his clergy, some of whom have been consecrated since then. And this is a group photo we took at that time. This is Bishop Christian Robertson, known as Mar Israel Thomas, and he lives in Canada, and he was consecrated several years ago at the home temple yurt. And this is Bishop Anthony. He lives in Staten Island, New York City, and he's a wonderful person. He's very helpful to me, calls me many times, and was a retired history professor, or taught history at high school, and is now authoring books and has written a novel and part of a trilogy and so on. And when I go to New York City, he very often greets me and picks me up. And if I do some kind of a lecture or presentation, he's always there. So he's a wonderful person. We have two bishops here, Ellie, who lives in Walnut Creek, and Isis Anya Mare Sophia Kumara. We just call her Anya, who was living in Ashland, Oregon, but then after her partner died, she was in Mexico for quite a while, and she's has gone through a lot of changes since then, but she's still active as a bishop. She's very very into mostly women's mysteries and the feminine mysteries. Bishop Ellie lives in San Jose. She manages an apartment house, and she's a very accessible person, very warm and kind person. Some people may want to meet her sometime. This is Bishop Keith Campbell. He has a website called God Smarts. It's actually a YouTube station. Keith studied with me for some time and was finally consecrated as a bishop. And he is living up in the area north of San Francisco, between San Francisco and Sacramento, and you can access him and get in contact with him through these links that I'm showing you. This is a photo that was taken of Bishops Luis that I consecrated in Lima, Peru, with Bishops Milton and Roberto. Both of them are lawyers from Colombia. and several home temple priests in Peru. Milton is at the extreme left, and Roberto is at the extreme right. Luis is right next to me on the left of the photo. And this is on the roof of Luis's sister's home, where we have done rituals and consecrations and other things. I have a very warm relationship with the bishops in Colombia and Peru, and have through them made contacts with other people in Brazil and Chile and so on. And they host me when I come by, and give me a place to stay and a place to give presentations and lectures. And they are the Peruvians are descendants of Incas, and very proud of that. What else I should say is that both Milton and Roberto, on the extreme ends of the photo, are fluent in English as well as Spanish, and have done a lot of translating for me. This is Bishop Vernon Marshall. He lives in Duckenfield near Manchester, England, and has established a church presence that he calls the Ecclesia Sophiana. I traveled to Manchester a year ago, one of the reasons being to consecrate him, and then for a vacation trip that Kat and I were taking. Vernon was for many, many years a Unitarian Universalist, Unitarian minister, has done a lot of study. He's a very kind person, a very knowledgeable person, and you can access him on Facebook. You can look up Ecclesia Sophiana or Vernon Marshall.